Alright, what's up, all you cool cats and kittens? It's your Commissioner Tim back on your screen for the post week 3 power rankings. I'm just gonna call these power rankings for the week we are in going forward now, because we always want to be looking ahead. So let's kick off the week 4 power rankings. Now that we are 3 weeks in, there's a little bit of more data that we can sort of utilize. So for me to get a little bit more nerdy than just showing you the raw points for, max points for, etc., we now have a lot of variability and consistency to plug in. So I want to prepare some graphs. And so we've got the data as approved by the Small Sample Size Institute. And let's geek out. All right, I'm gonna take myself off the screen here. And so when you look at the points for, on the range, right? After the first 3 games, we're looking at the box and whisker for points for to date. There are 2 themes to point out. One is on the range, but also is on the consistency. So on the range, we're seeing a graphical and a data-based representation that supports our preseason views on who the top 4 teams are, with the middle tier on Sergey and John, and bottom tier with Brandon and Travis. Now that said, on the consistency, there are a few teams that are incredibly consistent week to week. To highlight the high consistent teams, or just the consistent teams overall, Sergey has been the absolute model of consistency. Within 3 weeks, he's had a low of 111 and a high of 116, a variability of just 5 points in those 3 weeks we've had to date. Now, on the high-end performance side, Kyle is the most consistently high-scoring output leader in the league, as his first 2 weeks were both over 160, which is going to be good enough to win you many, many weeks. And his lowest scoring week was this past week 3, finishing at a tick under 150, but it was still good enough for the league high for the week. His team's been consistent, high-octane output. Last one to point out here that's a positive is Eve. His lowest scoring week has been 144 in week 3, but scored 170 and 148 in weeks 1 and 2. While sitting at 1 and 2, he's certainly been the top 3 scorer every single week in the league, and it's good enough to have the second highest median scoring output in the league, only behind Kyle. And so far, there's only 2 teams that are consistently inconsistent through these first 3 weeks, and that's going to be Ryan, and then I have the worst week-to-week variability in the league. So obviously points for in itself isn't going to tell the whole story, so let's loop over to max points for. So looking at the max points for graph, there isn't much other things to point out, but when we look at the points for graph overall, there isn't much other things to point out, but when we look at this max points for, it starts to show some interesting notes at overall competition potential firepower in the league. I especially like looking at the max points for because it shows who has the potential to beat who when. And in our league, even though the points for graph shows a clear top 4, I think all but Travis and Brandon can beat any of the other teams in the league this season. Obviously, you can't just look at the numbers by itself, as not all max points for is created equal. And what I mean by that is, for example, a contender would never start a boom bust player in most scenarios. But an upset can be had if that player booms for the underdog roster. And some of the max points for could also be a telling sign that you may have found either a gem, like Cordero Patterson last year, who's able to produce high numbers for an entire season due to the new situation, or you're seeing a young prospect, likely a rookie, blossom, who becomes an auto starter for future weeks going forward. So you definitely have to look at these numbers, but dive into the players who are producing these gaudy numbers on the bench. So I'm not going to do this for every single team, but just looking at sort of the teams. If you look at the John's roster, for example, full Jerry, while his points for is sitting in 5th, we know that looking at his max points for dispersion, he can beat any team in the league on his best week. And looking at what caused the discrepancy between his points for to date and his max points for, it's really been his QB2 position, as well as both of his RB1 and RB2. And these numbers are not on the graph, But his QB2 position has averaged 8.43 points per week so far. Largely, that's due to Trey Lance in week 1, disappointment in week 2 with his early game injury. But at the RB1 and RB2 position, they've averaged 6.3 points per week so far on both of those positions each, not just because Najee's slow start to the season, but because Akers in week 1 getting a donut, and a disappointing week by his new addition in Cordero Patterson in week 2, only who bounced back in week 3, and then also having David Montgomery plugged in at RB2 when he had an injury in early game in week 3. So going on Najee, while Najee himself is only averaging 11 points, John will always be starting Najee. But his RB2 has only produced 1.7 points a week so far, and we know these numbers won't be the case. Between his QB2, which is going to be fixed now that he's starting Trevor Lawrence, RB1 and RB2 numbers alone, we should start to see an average weekly points for total increase of about 20 points. It's pretty significant. That would actually put him in the 120 to 145 weekly range. And that gets pretty exciting from a playoff contention probability standpoint, especially as he has the benefit of sitting with the winning record at 2-1 to start the season. So I think John's the current most likely to sneak into playoffs for me right now due to these factors. And we should start to see these factors sort of changing his weekly points for average as the week sort of progresses, likely starting week 4. But now looking at Ryan, who obviously has the best max points for in the league, and it's not easy to, for him, it's not as easy to see how that max points for will now translate into pass form to increase his points for on a week-to-week basis, right? Most of his weekly max points for to date has come from Jared Goff and Carson Wentz outplaying Tom Brady and Russell Wilson by a large margin on the bench. But it may take balls of steel for Ryan to decide to start the backup quarterbacks ahead of Tom and Russell, at least for another couple of weeks. He obviously did that starting Jared Goff over Tom Brady. Not much discrepancy between Tom and what Jared Goff did in week 3. In earlier weeks, in weeks 1 and 2, though, he did have Jalen Waddle on the bench, who was then moved up to a starting 10 in week 3. But we also saw in week 3 that the Miami offense may not be able to sustain top-end plays for both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, certainly on a week-to-week basis. But we may see some increase, though, from his max points for to how that translates over to his points for category if Amari Cooper continues to play the way that he has in week 2 and week 3. I think at that point, it's going to be easy for him to plug and play Amari Cooper, who has been outproducing, certainly in week 2, week 3, into his flex spot at least, to get some of that consistent max points for now translating to actually his points for average. So that said, I think it's so far I think it's very fair to say that Ryan's overall roster has underperformed to date on what I think his season average is going to be, as his average season points for is just 131. But we may not see that much of a bump on the increases points for being created in the same maybe level or degree that we're seeing full Jerry's roster being able to get a little bit much more increase. So we may not see the points for being created solely based on the selection of his starter until at least his trusted quarterbacks in Russell and Tom start to play better. Or maybe once Deshaun Watson comes back. I think those are going to be the two sort of milestone triggers that's going to really have an impact, needle-moving impact to Ryan's, right now, what I think is a disappointing 130 points on a points for weekly basis. So like I said, I'm not going to do this for every single team, and I'm not going to be doing this every single weekly video for the future weeks as well. I'll probably just flash through these slides going forward, but just want to just sort of share, given that's our first time sharing this data, that how I view these stats along with the players causing these results and how I factor in my weekly power rankings. All right, so let's move over into the weekly standings. And right now, as Commissioner Brandon mentioned in his video, we've got an interesting sort of standing outlook. So far, we've got Kyle as the sole undefeated manager sitting at a perfect 3-0 with 4 teams sitting at a 2-1, Eve at 1-2, and Brandon and Travis sitting 0-3. And let's quickly look through points for and max points for, and we'll talk about these details. And this was obviously in the slides already, so I'll just quickly flip through these things. So all that said, everyone is a playoff hopeful right now. I could not have imagined a better league parity to start off this season for the second season of Cool Cats and Kittens. So everyone's got a shot at the playoffs, and obviously when I say everyone, I mean everyone but Travis and Brandon. So without burning them too much, I think Brandon and Travis will end up with a total of about 5 wins between the two of them for the entire season. By the way, those teams are designed to have those types of outcomes. Obviously, they're not going to go winless because they're going to have to face each other twice in this season. But that said, there's if we do the math, right, and I'm trying to get to sort of a playoff target, and I'll update these as there's significant sort of movements. But if you do the math on trying to figure out what the playoff win target looks like to get into that 4th seed, if Brandon and Travis get 5 wins, that means that there's a lot of wins to be shared with the rest of the league with the 6 managers. So if you do the math of the 14 weeks and 8 teams, there's going to be a total of 56 wins to be taken in the league. So for the remaining 6 teams, not Brandon and Travis, as they're going to be taking 5, there's going to be 51 wins remaining for the 6 teams, which means an average of 8.5 wins per team. Now, I think the top 3 teams, whoever they end up being, will take home 30 of those wins. At least I think that's conservative, but I think 30 or 31, somewhere there, netting out about 7 wins. That's going to be the average for the remaining 3. So the 4th, 5th, and 6th, I think, will average 7 wins between them. So that said, I do think 9 wins is what I think certainly locks in a 4th seed without any tiebreakers. But just like last season, it may get to tiebreakers. And if that's the case, you certainly need 8 wins on a tiebreaker for the 4th and the final playoff spot this year. So until week 10 or so, my power rankings will continue to be weighed towards current standings, continue to represent the probability of making the playoffs. And as we get into the later part of the season, it will start to reflect a little bit more around what I think is an actual contender, or the probability of them winning the championship, as the playoff probability locks are starting to take form. And we can sort of see who the players are going to be going to playoffs at that point. All right, so let's move over to the power rankings. There were a lot of movements in the week, especially in the middle group. So let's start off at number 8. I'm going to start off with 4-putt here. A couple things. I'm going to keep these sections quick going forward, especially because I had the data sets in the beginning talking about those, the max points for the box and whisker plots. I think 4-putt sitting at 4th or 8th, and I think the tiebreaker between him and the next team who's sitting at 7th is just Brandon, who's obviously sitting at 7. I don't think I need to spoil anything there. But I think Brandon's team certainly has rookies, high-end rookies, that are more likely to be producing higher numbers as the season progresses. Now, the points for, max points for, points against, all those types of things. Obviously, points against, 4-putt has had bad luck, but his points for is sitting at the bottom, so I don't think it really matters. But that's been sort of the tiebreaker at 4-putt sitting at 8 for the season as well, in heading into week 4. That said, week 3 is great. I've been, I traded Khalil Herbert away as part of the Kyle Pitts package over to Travis in the off season. It's a player that I'm pretty high up on, especially with the new, Luke Getsy's offense. They've said it as much that Khalil Herbert's style of running fits their offense of what they're trying to design a lot more than David Montgomery. And it's telling that David Montgomery did not get his option renewed. So he's likely not going to be a Bear next year. I'm talking about David Montgomery. And we saw Khalil Herbert really breaking out. Massive numbers. He was the RB1, the true RB1 of the season. Unfortunately, he sat on the bench, not producing the numbers. 4-putt maybe could have snuck out with the victory there if Khalil Herbert was on there. But I think Khalil Herbert has shown in week 3 that he's a potential dynasty cornerstone, especially with that Monty contract situation. All right, moving over to number 7, I've got Brandon. So obviously I didn't really spoil anything here. You can see the numbers there. He's obviously tied at 7th, still winless. I think the positive here, obviously, Brandon mentioned in his video, is the Romeo Dubs showed up after an awesome preseason, all the preseason hype, and the fortunate sort of Christian Watson injury really allowing for Romeo Dubs, along with the other injuries to the other receiving corps, but really allowed Romeo Dubs to really show. I believe he caught all of his passes coming from Aaron Rodgers in week 3. So obviously Aaron Rodgers is a huge fan of receivers that he can just continue to rely on. And I do think Romeo Dubs is going to be a stud. Like, he's going to be good. I don't know if he's going to be in, wide receiver 1, top 12 type of play, but we know that Dubs is a great player. Late breakout in, Nevada for the Reno-based team. But I do think Romeo Dubs could be a player that makes it into part of Bills Mafia's cornerstones. And if Romeo Dubs breaks out, that's not 5. It could be 6 cornerstones for Bills Mafia, which takes it well beyond sort of the wildest imaginations of what a success, at least for me, on looking at Bills Mafia's roster looks like. So this team is starting to take shape, and honestly, yeah, he's sitting at 0-3, but with all those first picks in the next year, I think he's got 5 on top of all these players that are showing signs of becoming stars, that they can be stars in their situations. I think this is going to be a really, really nice roster come next season. All right, so now let's move over into the playoff hopefuls, the remaining 6. At number 6, I've got Mr. Ambassador dropping a spot here. And we saw in the numbers in points for, as well as max points for, Mr. Ambassador is the most consistent output manager in the league so far. That said, the average range is 111 to 116. That's not going to be enough to win you many weeks at all. Obviously, the benefit that Sergey's had to date is he's had a very easy strength of schedule so far through the first 3 weeks, and it's gave him the 2-1, the winning record, which the fact that you have a winning record is going to put you into playoff contention, especially if he can sustain this. Obviously, he's got a hard week coming up this week. But if he's able to, I think, Brandon mentioned this, but I look at Mr. Ambassador's power rankings along with Cup to Canada Eves that I'll share in a little bit as we progress through these rankings. If Ambassador takes off with a upset victory over Cup to Canada this week, this is going to be, quite the mover for the rankings, and you'll see sort of why. I mentioned all this, and it's certainly going to shoot Mr. Ambassador well up, because 3-1 to start the season is a needle mover in terms of your playoff probability, especially with only 4 teams that are going to be making it. That said, I have some of the teams with this section that I'm calling Dark Horse, which are going to be sort of these boosters to the average points for that we've seen so far. I think Joe Mixon's had obviously a really disappointing start. Week 1 was great, but week 2 and week 3, especially with some of the injuries that he experienced, hopefully that's not what we see in Joe Mixon. I think he's had a long enough career, especially we know that Cincinnati's offense should be top end. So as all those things start to sort of come into place, if Joe Mixon continues to do well, James Robinson looks like he's going to be really solidifying that position for the Jacksonville's offense, and that Jacksonville's offense looks good. And DK Metcalf, hopefully the Seattle passing offense is able to figure things out. Geno certainly does not look like a bad quarterback. So we saw Metcalf sort of having his first good week in week 3, and hopefully we start to sort of see these taking shape. I think players like Metcalf, especially with a new quarterback, it may take a player of his talent to still take a couple of weeks or a few weeks to really, really on-ramp to what his season average is going to look like for the rest of the season. And hopefully we saw that in week 3. So, combined with those 3 teams, we could see an increase of 20-plus points a week from Sergey's, 111, 113 average through the first 3 weeks so far. Okay, moving over to number 5, I've got full Jerry here. So obviously, as John pointed out in last week's video, I think John deserved to be at number 5 last week, especially with him beating Sergey in week 2. But I think certainly with week three's performance and the numbers that I was talking about earlier on in terms of where he could really see and where he will actually immediately see increases, that has nothing to do with the players breaking out. It just has to do with the sort of the unfortunate timing and the bad luck that had to do with his injuries to the QB2, as well as even at the RB2 position, Dave Montgomery last week, and then Cam Akers in week one with the donut. So, like I said, room to improve on average in points forward coming in weeks, in the coming weeks at the QB2 as well as RB1 and RB2. I think it will start to net him around the 120, 145 weekly average range. And that's going to be competitive for him, for a playoff contender. I think the dark horses, the same theme as Sergey, players like Trevor Lawrence. I mean, that offense looks good. Trevor Lawrence looks good. Devonta Smith had his breakout. So if you really take out week one, which you could really easily toss it up because they're just trying to feature AJ Brown. It's his first time with his friend at quarterback on a new team. They just paid him the big bucks. But if week two and week three on average, obviously we're not going to see week three all the time, but week two and week three average with volatility here and there, certainly not going to a donut. I think that's going to be moving the needle for him, as well as now Jordy and Najee, the players that I mentioned before, should and could tilt the weekly average much higher for John, even beyond the 120 to 145 range, I think. All right, moving on to number 4. I've got Brady Stir Dynasty. So it might be a little disrespect to the inaugural champ here, but obviously he had the massive league-setting week for max points for in week 2 with 241 max points for, but just scored 159 on max points for in week 2. I think that same week. So it really goes back to the numbers I was talking about where, John with his max points for, how it converts into points for with easy sort of, changes, and then just factoring out the bad luck, can really see him increase on his points for without really doing much work. I think Brady Stir Dynasty is in a little bit of a tougher situation where there aren't many paths that he as a manager can select week in and week out with consistency on who on his bench is going to be plugged in. And the thoughts here though is the tiebreaker on why I had Brady Stir Dynasty at 4, because I think this and the next team, maybe next two teams, are sort of in similar tiers, is that Brady Stir Dynasty to date has only finished in the top 3 once. So his first week was 4th finish, second week was week 2 was 2nd, and then this past week in week 3 he finished 6th in the league. So his points for is quite weak, as I mentioned before, and we're going to have to see that number increase a little bit for him to start to see the increase in his sort of power rankings in the future weeks. All right, moving on to number 3, and there might be a little surprise here. I am putting myself at number 3. You see the stats there, the gross stats there. I think the only reason I will put myself here, and obviously the next team, because it's obvious who the number 1 is, but this means that Eve's at number 2. The reason why Eve at 1 and 2 versus me at 2 and 1, I thought Eve had a higher sort of ranking that he deserved than my team and Ryan's, is on my team, there's just been injuries to Swift. And I think he's a player that's demonstrated injuries and missing games in his first 2 seasons so far. And so certainly, after week 2, he was already just, showing injuries. And after week 3 with the shoulder injury now, I think it's likely he's going to be missing some weeks. On top of that, you have inconsistencies in players like Kyler, Jonathan Taylor, and Justin Jefferson that you would not expect with players of that caliber and the systems that are really designed for them to flourish. And then still waiting on the breakouts of Javonte Williams and Kyle Pitts. And I also don't have the benefit of having anyone really that on the bench that I can plug and play and wait this out. That said, I mean, these are all very, very talented players. And so I think for me, by week 8, this team should have its ranking tiered settled, whether it's a playoff contender or a true contender for the chip. And I think I will have a very good sense of what I think my power ranking really is at that point in terms of my probability to win it all this season. But for now, until those things are addressed, I think number 3 is where I sit. All right, moving over to number 2. I mean, this is a dude that jumped up 2 spots. I don't think we've had a single, more than 1 spot increase or decrease in any given week. Obviously, I think it's still, similar tier. You could put Cup to Canada as low as 4 just because of the record. But if you take out the record and just on the numbers of the stats alone, I mean, Cup to Canada is a no doubt top 2. I mean, look at the points for there, max points for. And yeah, he's sitting at 1 and 2 because he's faced the 2 highest scoring opponents in his first 2 weeks. And finally got his victory in week 3. But he's in the same tier as Kyle when it just comes to the numbers, when you take aside the record. And he's also got more depth than Kyle as well. So Cup to Canada takes number 2 ahead of Trusted Process here, really due to the vulnerabilities and the inconsistency that I mentioned on my side. The tiebreaker between really, Ryan and myself as well has been Cup to Canada's strength of schedule and points against to date. He's the only manager that's been able to score in the top 3 every single week, along with Kyle. So those are the top 2. And given that the difference between a 2 and 1 team and a 1 and 2 team isn't really that much of a difference, especially when you've only played 3 weeks and you've got 11 more weeks to go, especially for a team of this caliber, producing the numbers that they are, I feel like number 2 is the right and appropriate position for me to rank up Cup to Canada this week. All right. Sitting at number 2, Kyle, sitting at number 1, Moncton Meerkats has now tied the record for the longest time a team has gone staying at the number 1 spot. So congrats to you, Kyle, and I wouldn't be surprised if you stay on this position for many weeks to go. Points for goes without saying, number 1 in the league. Max points for it's there as well. I think the benefit of Moncton Meerkats is if you look at the efficiency, that his max points for is 530 and his points for is just 60 points behind. That's incredible efficiency when you look at sort of the league-wide average and what you see on a general basis in fantasy leagues, period. And that's because he's got the benefit of having definitive players that he's going to plug and play. So when players like Mike Evans gets injured, he's just not going to play him like he did in week 3. But, that said, the only vulnerability that we saw is the QB2 position. But honestly, Lamar may be good enough to not even need to worry about that right now. And most of the other players on his roster, aside from Lamar playing out of his mind, are still playing to their level of expectations. The only large concern, and this is a large one, is on Eckler, just because of the carry numbers. We continue to see issues there, and on a recent podcast that Eckler is on, he was mentioning that the coaches for the Chargers now have Josh O'Kelly and Sony Michel taking the short end goal sort of carries, which used to be the role that Eckler had last year when he finished in the top 3 RB. So that's certainly going to have an impact to not just his carrying numbers, but also his touchdown production, which he benefited greatly from last season. So that said, even if Eckler is not there, he's still going to be a mid RB2 at worst, just because of his PPR volume. But I do think Moncton Meerkats, even if Eckler is not even an RB2 and he just tanks, even if he was a donut or didn't even have that on the roster, Moncton Meerkats sitting at 3-0, he's definitely a lock for the playoffs. And that's the first team that I'll say is a lock for the playoffs right now. And as Commissioner Brandon mentioned in his video, I think what's really interesting for this is that, if you have a team as talented as Moncton Meerkats, but it's sort of bedridden with a lot of players with previous injury concerns, who have displayed, cases of missing a lot of time every season of their careers, this 3-0 start is incredible. It takes a lot of the stress out, and so if those cases ever are to happen, then you're still sitting with a playoff lock because of all the wins that you've been able to sort of push out before any of those bad sort of luck things have taken place. So that wraps it up for the power rankings. Congrats to all the movers and shakers. Kyle, shout out to you, man, and Eve. I think you deserve the number 2 place. I think that said, circling back to what I was talking about, Sergey, is this week's going to be really important for you and Sergey. I think if you start out the season at 1-3, that is vastly different than a 2-2, especially if that means that Sergey now moves up to 3-1 as well. So. The sleeper projections, at least, however accurate it is, has the matchup decently close. I believe it's the closest projected matchup for week 4. So Good luck to both of you guys. It's going to be a really important week, and let's finish it off with the slide, sort of sharing the final list in full with all the points for the season. So that does it for me. It's been a joy. See you guys tomorrow, Sunday, and Monday. Peace.